spending, with the capabilities of the American military nearly unlimited. So Iran, in that sense, has a choice. But we've made it very clear to them, this is nuclear sites, this is nuclear capabilities, this is the line that the president set, and we set that back. Now is the time to come forward for peace. But I think one of the takeaways from this as well is the unprecedented level of ongoing cooperation. I can't speak highly enough of the chairman and his staff and General Kurilla in CENTCOM, what they've done to look around the corner, to pre-position, to understand how an operation like this comes together. The scope and scale of what occurred last night would take the breath away of almost any American if you had an opportunity to watch it in real time. And I think Tehran is certainly calculating the reality that planes flew from the middle of America in Missouri overnight, completely undetected over 3 of their most highly sensitive sites, and we were able to destroy nuclear capabilities. And our boys in those bombers are on their way home right now. We believe that'll have a clear psychological impact on how they view the future, and we certainly hope they take the path of negotiated peace. But I could not be more proud of how this building operated, of the precision, the sensitivity, and the professionalism of the troops involved in this effort. I will take one more. We'll take one more question. Yes, right there.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Concerning the justification for these strikes, in March, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released their threat assessment, concluding, quote, Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear programs he suspended in 2003, unquote. So what new intelligence does the U.S. have since then that the Iranians have changed their position on nuclear weapons? And does this new intelligence come from U.S. sources and methods, or are we getting this information from other countries?
Well, I would just simply say that the president's made it very clear. He's looked at all of this, all of the intelligence, all of the information, and come to the conclusion that the Iranian nuclear program is a threat, and was willing to take this precision operation to neutralize that threat in order to advance American national interests, reduce the Iranian nuclear program, and obviously collective self-defense of ourselves and our allies. So he looked at all of it, understood the nature of the threat, and took bold action I think the American people would expect in a commander-in-chief. That's all we've got. Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Mr. Chairman.
And that was a press conference that was being given by U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, speaking at the Pentagon, alongside the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane. The general gave basically a breakdown of the details of the operation, so-called Midnight Hammer, that has been going on in Iran to hit 3 individual nuclear sites within Iran. He listed the agencies involved. It's clearly a very complex operation. He was also very positive about the level of teamwork that had gone on to bring the attack together. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had made the point that this was to destroy or severely degrade Iran's nuclear program. He said we did not target Iranian troops. We did not target the Iranian people. He was very specific about the narrowness, as he saw it, of the operation. He also spent several minutes heaping praise on President Trump for having been the coalescing force, essentially, behind the decision to take this action. Let's go to Alan Fisher, who is live for us in Washington, D.C. Alan, a couple of things that did strike me was that Pete Hegseth was, as I was mentioning, very intent on specifying this was a single targeted operation, and there appeared to be no attempt either to expand it out with the targets that had been hit or to try to institute regime change in Iran.
Very clear message there from the United States that this is not an open-ended operation, although there is the warning that while it was intentionally limited, the capabilities of the United States military is not, and therefore, in the words of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, retaliation on America, American assets, interests and people, and allies as well, would be a very poor choice. What is clear is that this was a well-coordinated operation. Well, Donald Trump on Thursday said he would give the Iranians 2 weeks, a 2-week window. The decision was made probably sometime late on Thursday or early on Friday, and that is when everything started in motion. 24 hours ago, we were talking about how we were tracking B-2 bombers flying to Hawaii and then on to Guam. And I spoke to an expert yesterday, and he said, look, there's a real possibility this is going to be the operation. It could get underway in a few hours. Turns out he was absolutely bang on the money. As you would say, there was a lot of praise for Donald Trump. He was asked, Pete Hegseth was asked if there was a moment when Donald Trump made the decision. He said he realised that the Iranians were stonewalling him in negotiations, and while there wasn't a moment, he was aware that he decided that he was going to take action against the Iranians, which involved MOPs, as they're called, massive ordnance penetration. Essentially, these so-called barrack buster bombs. They went in, they hit a number of targets, and they were also backed up by Tomahawks fired from aircraft and also from submarines to destroy the capabilities of the Iranians. The Americans are saying this was a huge success, a complete success, but as we heard from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they obviously still have to get full intelligence from the site, satellite photos, that sort of thing. It will take some time, so they don't know whether it has been a huge success. But what it does do is send a real message. And if there was one irony throughout that, 30-minute news conference, it was that several times they talked about how it was important they kept the circle of knowledge in this very tight, that it was confidential, that very few people knew about it. Of course, when there was an attack in Yemen earlier this year, Pete Hegseth not only included a journalist on the talks about what was going to happen in Yemen, he also included his wife. So the idea that security is much tighter, perhaps that really was a lesson to be learned for the Defense Secretary of the United States of America.
Yeah, and according to Pete Hegseth, essentially the decision-making process in terms of whether or not to go ahead with this strike appeared to be very clear-headed. The decision was very clearly made. However, we should remember Donald Trump is facing pushback on this, not only, of course, from members of Congress, but also from members of his own party, his own supporters, who do not want the U.S. to be involved in this. There are also questions over whether or not this is actually constitutional, Alan.
Well, Donald Trump campaigned on the fact that he didn't want America to get involved in another Middle East war. He said they were stupid, they were expensive, they were unnecessary. In fact, way back when Barack Obama was in office, Donald Trump said, stand back and watch, effectively. Barack Obama is going to attack Iran to distract from his problems. He has been against intervention in the Middle East. It is part of the American First, essentially, agenda to stay away from these things. Questions about whether or not it's legal, well, there's going to be a number of motions tabled in both houses of Congress on Monday, suggesting that the President needs to get permission from the War Powers Act. What he did last night, what he did on Saturday, that is not illegal. Presidents have the right to take action if they think there is a threat to the United States. And many in this White House will argue that there was a clear threat to the United States. So it is not against the Constitution. If it were to be sustained and go on over a long period, then yes, he would need approval of Congress. It is up to Congress then to declare war, if there was a formal declaration of war. Is it against international law? That's where it becomes much harder, because, of course, you've got to prove there was an immediate threat if you take this level of action against Iran. And many people will say that there was no immediate threat, given we heard the intelligence from the DNI saying the Iranians were not working on a bomb. But, of course, very rarely do we see people held to account when they breach international law in this way.
Alan, thank you very much indeed. That's Alan Fisher talking to us from Washington, D.C. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps has responded to the nuclear site attacks, saying the United States' repetition of past failed follies demonstrates strategic incompetence and disregard for the realities on the ground in the region. Instead of learning from repeated failures, Washington's effectively placed itself on the front lines of aggression by directly attacking peaceful installations. The flight locations of the planes participating in this aggression have been identified and monitored. The number, dispersion and size of U.S. military bases in the region are not a strength, but they've doubled their vulnerability. We're going to go to Ali Hashim. He's in the Iranian capital, Tehran. So we have been hearing reaction coming out of Iran. We've also heard from Iran's Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi. This statement from Iran's Revolutionary Guard seems somewhat muted to some degree. It doesn't say anything specific, although it clearly has a very strong message with regard to the attacks.
Well, Rob, most of the statements today, because we just saw the statement by President Masoud Pezeshkian, who condemned the attack, also said that it's the failure of deterrence within Israel that led them to force the U.S. to be involved. The Iranian strategy will continue to retaliate, and that Israel lacks the independent capabilities or courage to attack without U.S. backing. So this is the president. He also kept his own response within this ambiguous dimension. It applies to the IRGC, as you were saying, and also to Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. The three reserved Iran's right to retaliate, to response. However, they kept all the cards on the table. And it's clear this is mainly because the body that is to decide on how and what and where to retaliate is the Supreme National Security Council. And of course, after the Supreme National Security Council convenes and decides, then the Supreme Leader should give his okay to that. Till the moment, these measures, at least they're not announced, so we don't know what is going to be the next step. And that's why these bodies, different bodies, are giving responses, but within a kind of an ambiguous sense.
Ali, thank you very much indeed. That's Ali Hashim talking to us there from Tehran. Well, Iran has retaliated to the U.S. attacks by firing missiles into Israel. They struck northern and central areas, including the cities of Tel Aviv and Haifa. Bernard Smith is joining us now from Amman. He's been monitoring the situation that's going on in Israel at the moment. Bernard, just give us a brief update of the attacks that Israel has been going through.
Rob, 2 waves of missiles fired at Israel, about 25 in total, says the Israeli military, and 10 impact sites. And people are living in those impact sites in Tel Aviv and in Haifa and a couple of other parts of Israel emerged from their shelters to see a lot of devastation, to see rescue teams picking through rubble. One of them in Haifa, it's believed, is actually a misfired interceptor rocket that fell back to the ground rather than an intercepted Iranian ballistic missile. But those considerable damage caused in parts of Israel hit by those Iranian ballistic missiles. It's not put the Israelis off, though. Huge support for the American attack on those nuclear bases in Iran. Benjamin Netanyahu thanking Donald Trump, a bold decision. He said it would change history. Even the opposition saying that they welcomed this, made Israel a safer place, a right and correct thing for Israel to do, said Yair Lapid, an opposition leader. And a further indication of how the Israeli sentiment is about what's happened in the last few hours. The Israeli stock market opened up today on a record high.
That's Bernard Smith talking to us there from Amman. Bernard, thank you very much indeed. Well, Iran's foreign minister is next headed to Russia, where he's set to have talks with President Vladimir Putin on Monday. Yulia Shapovalova is joining us now from Moscow. It's worth remembering, of course, that Russia and Iran have a very close relationship. Iran's foreign minister has been on this tour of diplomacy in Geneva and in Istanbul, now in Russia. What is he hoping, do you think, he's going to get from Russia?
Well, what we know that the Kremlin has already confirmed that the meeting will indeed take place tomorrow on Monday. Things change very quickly. We just received a comment from head of Russia's Rosatom Nuclear Energy Corporation, Likhachov. He has said that the U.S. strikes did not affect the part of Iran where the Bushehr nuclear power plant is located. The situation there is currently calm, but in the event of a threat to Russian personnel working there, Russia is ready for immediate evacuation of its staff. And earlier, Vladimir Putin raised the issue of Russia's personnel safety to be ensured. So according to the Russian president, Prime Minister Netanyahu agreed not to target those facilities, and Donald Trump supported that too. As you know, Russia has built a nuclear reactor at Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant, and according to Vladimir Putin, Russia has signed contracts for 2 more. And despite the hostilities, the Russian employees continue to work in Bushehr, so probably this issue will be raised tomorrow. Generally, the Russian side seems to be very disappointed with U.S. actions, and even though the Kremlin has not yet officially commented on the U.S. night strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, the Russian Foreign Ministry has strongly condemned them. Russian diplomats have said that missile and bomb strikes on the territory of a sovereign state grossly violate international law and the UN Charter, no matter what arguments they are presented with. And the consequences of this action, including radioactive one, will have to be assessed.
Yulia, thank you very much indeed. There's Yulia Shapovalova talking to us there from Moscow. Well, joining me on set is Mohamed Saloom. He's an assistant professor in critical security studies at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. I want to ask you about something that was referred to in the press conference that was just given, particularly by the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane. He was asked about where he thought the possible targets would be or could be for Iran, with specific reference in the question to whether or not Iraq was going to be at issue. Is there anything to suggest? Are there any clues that we have as to where Iran may choose to strike?
Well, Iran has different areas to choose to strike back. Iraq as well. By the way, even asking about Iraq is very important, because over the last 2 days, the Israeli airplanes actually targeted groups on the Iraqi-Iranian borders, and they assassinated the bodyguard of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, and he was assassinated there. With him, there was a senior Iraqi militia leader who was also killed, and it was publicly declared by the group in Iraq. But these targets, I mean, Iran has so many targets in the region if they want to respond to the U.S., but also there is a scenario where the Iranians might not respond against the U.S. at all, and they would instead just focus on Israel. And this is what happened right after the bombardment earlier this morning. And because Iran understands that mounting more pressure against Israel would actually pay off. Because at the moment, the scene we have in front of us is that President Trump indeed launched a bombardment and targeted 3 nuclear sites. But he also has thrown the ball in the Iranian court, saying that if you respond, there will be a bigger war in the region. Iran might say, okay, we're not going to respond to the U.S. because we want the U.S. to stay out of this conflict. Let us just focus on Israel. So far, this is what happened. So we might be in front of this scenario.
We are assuming, of course, that whatever response Iran is going to make is going to be predominantly missile-led. But of course, Iran has a very well-developed cyber attack capability as well. It also has, in the past, used terrorism. It has taken hostages. Can you see a scenario, given the impact that Iran has had on, say, its stockpiles of missiles, that it might choose actually to respond in a different way, possibly one of the ways I've mentioned?
Yeah, definitely. They can. These possibilities are all on the table, but I don't see Iran doing any of these at the moment. The Iranian government would only do that if they feel that this is the end, that the West, the Americans, the Israelis are all coming to topple the regime. I don't see the Iranian strategist and government at this stage, at this point, maybe in the future, but now, because, if they go, for example, for cyber attacks, they have already tried that. And I think the Israeli side said that they were not very much effective, while the Israelis were very much effective targeting some banks inside Tehran. But for terrorism, I don't think this would work in Iran's favor. They understand the international mood. We can see that their foreign minister is still in a tour. He's going to Russia. He was in Istanbul. He was in Turkey. So I think they're still having hope that they can combine diplomacy with missiles and with some pressure on Israel to achieve some result. But the window is closing, really.
Mohamed Saloom, we appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed. Well, Abbas Aslani is a senior research fellow at the Center for Middle East Strategic Studies. He's joining us from our Tehran bureau. Good to have you with us. Let me ask you about the kind of speculation there must be, I would imagine, in Iran about how Iran is likely to respond to this. What are the possible scenarios that you can see?
Well, as we speak, we have been seeing that there have been escalatory attacks against Israel. This seems to be the case in the coming days. And Iran might be increasing the pressure on Israel, trying to inflict much more pain and costs on the regime. In addition to that, I think Iran will have no option but to respond to the Americans as well and their interests in the region, because the way that Donald Trump was speaking following the aggression on nuclear facilities, the tone and the words, I think, as well as the action, leaves no choice for Iran but to respond. But we are hearing also from officials, from the members of parliament, talking about withdrawal from the non-proliferation treaty. This indicates that Iran might be reviewing its cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, as well as, seriously considering withdrawal from the NPT. And scaling up the nuclear activities in the longer run could be an option. There has been discussions that the damages cannot be denied against the nuclear facilities, but Iran's nuclear program is considered to be enjoying of three crucial components: know-how and the knowledge, the facilities and the equipment, as well as the nuclear materials. So far, the know-how as well as the nuclear materials seem to be intact, but the facilities have been suffering from damages. They could be recovered in future. So that's why Iran insists on developing the nuclear program and thinks that this is not a destruction. This might be a short-term tactical relative win for the other side, but strategically looking at this issue, I think the story could end up to be a different one rather than what the narrative that Americans have been presenting.
In the meantime, there seems to be some sort of, if not a diplomatic effort by Iran's foreign minister, then certainly an effort at communication by Abbas Araghchi. We know now that he's heading to Russia. He's going to have talks with President Vladimir Putin on Monday. We have had analysts here over the last couple of days suggesting that Russia's response to what's been happening in Iran has been more muted than Iran might have hoped for. What do you think Iran's foreign minister is hoping to get out of that meeting with Vladimir Putin?
Iran has been reaching out to other countries as well as in bilateral and multilateral formats in order to urge them to condemn the attacks, specifically this aggression against the nuclear facilities that are considered to be the first of its kind, in history. And we have been hearing that some countries have been somehow showing interest that they might be offering support to Tehran directly or indirectly and gradually in the course of time, because they think that the course of actions or developments in the region might be to the detriment of their interests in the longer run. Because with the rising U.S. influence in the region, some other global powers might be seeing that they are losing, influence in the region, and their interests are being impacted and undermined. So that's why I think Iran will try to reach out to other countries, including Russia, or specifically a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, in order to use the potentials, at least in the political level, to counter this pressure. And I think now the risk of escalation is yet there. This is not the end game, but it is just a new beginning, and we can be seeing new developments. And here, I think the role of other countries in order to control the situation and preventing it from the situation, leading to a full-scale and regional war and fire will be very important, unless I think this will escalate and expand to a newer level whereby other players could be involved, and this could not just be limited to Iran, Israel, and the United States.
We're going to leave it there for the moment. Abbas Aslani, thank you very much indeed for being with us on Al Jazeera. Well, Colin Clark is the Director of Research at the Sufan Center. It's a global intelligence and security consultancy. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. So thank you very much indeed for being with us. General Dan Kane, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, giving details we heard just in the last half hour of the raid that had been carried out. In your estimation, and of course we're still waiting to see what kind of damage has been done to the 3 sites that were struck, but given the way that the General was describing the raid, what would be your assessment of how effective that raid would be?
Well, the U.S. seems extremely confident that the Iranian nuclear infrastructure has been put beyond use for the foreseeable future. I think, these statements are so overwhelming and so blatant that leads me to believe that the U.S., again, is extremely confident. However, there's still a formal battle damage assessment that's pending, and that becomes a bit cumbersome given the reliance on satellite imagery and just the sheer devastation on the ground. It'll take a while to kind of sift through the rubble, to figure out exactly what's going on down there.
General was making it fairly clear that he was impressed at how straightforward, and I'm using obviously that phrase as somebody who doesn't really understand the technicalities of doing something like this, but it appears to have been relatively straightforward in terms of getting the planes in and out again with very little problems. In the event that it turns out that the level of damage that the US is expecting is not as great as they had hoped for, and they might have to go in again, how easy are they going to find it a second time?
Well, I think politically it may be more difficult because there's, indications of various aspects of the Trump administration saying, we've done our part, now we're out. As you know, there are members of Trump's base that want nothing to do with this and see this as an Israeli fight, not an American one. So there's political constraints. Militarily, I think it'll be less difficult simply because, the past 8 or 9 days of fighting, the Israelis have really worn down Iranian anti-missile defense, Iranian radars. It seems that the B-2 bombers were able to kind of reach their targets without any issues at all. And the bombing continues, as you know, as we speak. And so this is a fight that's far from over. But, I certainly think it is on the table for the U.S. to get back involved. Less likely, at the moment, though, given some of the indications from the U.S. on the perceived level of success.
Colin Clark, it's really good to get your breakdown of that, and we appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed for your time. UN nuclear watchdog chief Rafael Grossi has posted on X saying he's calling an emergency meeting of the IAEA Board of Governors after the US military strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. The off-site radiation levels in Iran are not reported to have increased, but the IAEA says it's going to provide more information as it becomes available. Yossi Michelberg is a senior consulting fellow at Chatham House, and he's an expert in Israeli politics. He's joining us from London. Thank you so much for being with us. In your estimation, given the strikes that the US has carried out, do you think that that draws a line under this for Israel, or are we likely to see Israel carrying on its attacks in Iran for the indefinite period?
Good afternoon. I don't think, as far as what I can hear from Israel, the kind of statements that think this is over by a long stretch. And that's one of the challenges right now, to what point move from the military operation into the realm of diplomacy. Because there always the question is, what's the real objective of these military operations, at least by Israel? Is it only about nuclear? Is it also about reducing Iran capabilities to support whether movements or countries that oppose Israel, or even regime change? You might look at them as related to one another and interlinked, but not necessarily so. On the other hand, from the United States, as we could just hear earlier, for the United States, it's not about regime change. In this case, if Israel wants to continue for a much longer time, then it's for the American administration to put a stop to it, and together with other members of the international community to move as quickly as possible into the negotiation table and set some realistic objectives.
With regard to the negotiations, that is obviously something that Donald Trump says he has been pushing for up until just the last few days. It is also something that Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, said that he was open to being involved in until these attacks took place. In the longer-term event that there was a possibility of negotiations about Iran's nuclear program starting again, how likely is it, do you think, that Israel would allow those negotiations to go ahead?
Well, I think it's not for Israel at the end of the day to dictate. It's there allies of Israel that support it all through this war and then the last 21 months, for better and for worse. And so at a certain point to come back to Israel and say this war needs to come to an end, the way that the war in Gaza should come to an end, be sidelined a little bit what's happening right now in Gaza or in the West Bank. But the wars need to come to an end and look for a political solution. At the end of the day, there is an international consensus that Iran shouldn't have nuclear weapons. I think there is generally also consensus the Middle East should be a nuclear-free zone. So we need to move quickly towards that. But this, at the end of the day, won't be solved only through military action. It will be resolved with all countries' sense and pressures from the international community, and to look into a verified process that no one can deceive the inspection, that uranium is not enriched to a level that a country, whether it's Iran and any other country in the region, to develop a nuclear military capability. So the idea that Israel can dictate for the rest of the international community negotiation or not, I don't think this should be realistic either.
Yossi, we have about 30 seconds left. It's very, very brief. In the event that Israel decides that its goals have been met as a result of these attacks, what would its options be for the immediate future? And as I say, we've got about 20 seconds.
I think it's to look actually to de-escalate it, because Israel also suffered from this war. This war, it's for the first time also that cities and towns are held. So I think it's also in Israel's interest to de-escalate and look for a diplomatic solution out of it.
Yossi, thank you very much indeed. Yossi Michelberg talking to us there and giving us that analysis. Thank you very much indeed. Well, one more note on Israel's attacks in Gaza. Medical services say ambulances have completely stopped operating in Gaza City because of the Israelis' ongoing ban on fuel entering the Strip. At least 6 people have been killed in Israeli attacks in Gaza overnight during an internet blackout that's lasted 5 hours. Among those killed are a married couple who died when their apartment to the north of Nuseirat was hit. At least 3 people were also killed in attacks on displaced people living in tents to the west of Khan Yunis. Stay with us on Al Jazeera. And I'm Rob Matheson. This is Al Jazeera live from Doha with our continuing coverage of the U.S. strikes on Iran. Iran accuses the U.S. of betraying international diplomacy by attacking 3 of its nuclear sites.
We were in the middle of talks and negotiation with Europeans. Happened only 2 days ago in Geneva, when this time Americans decided to blow it up.
Overnight, President Trump ordered stealth bombers to strike at the heart of Iran's nuclear program.
The lead B-2 dropped 2 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator weapons on the first of several aim points at Fordo.
And also ahead, an internet blackout ends in Gaza, but not the killing. At least 6 Palestinians are killed overnight by Israel. Iran's foreign minister is accusing the United States of betraying diplomacy. Abbas Araghchi made the comments after the U.S. military's attack on Iran's 3 key nuclear sites. Araghchi says diplomacy is no longer an option, as the Americans only understand the language of threat and force. Julie Degar reports.
The aftermath of strikes that could reshape the region. The U.S. military says it's bombed 3 of Iran's key nuclear sites, Fordo, Natanz and Esfahan. US President Donald Trump described it as necessary to prevent Iran's development of a nuclear weapon. despite the International Atomic Agency and his own intelligence chief saying there's no evidence to support that allegation.
It is an outrageous, grave, and unprecedented violation of the fundamental principles of the Charter of the United Nations and international law. The warmongering and lawless administration in Washington is solely and fully responsible for the dangerous consequences and far-reaching implications of its act of aggression.
President Trump claimed Iran's major nuclear facilities had been totally obliterated, a statement denied by the parliamentary member for Qom, where Fordo is based. Qassem Ravanbash said damage was not as severe as reported in US media and was only above ground and could be restored. And the US attack legitimized the use of military operations against its own forces in the region. Iran's foreign minister says Washington has crossed a very big red line.
While President Trump was elected on a platform of putting an end to America's costly involvement of forever wars in our part of the world, he has betrayed not only Iran by abusing our commitment to diplomacy, but also deceived his own voters by submitting to the wishes of a wanted war criminal who has grown accustomed to exploiting the lives and wealth of American citizens to further the Israeli regime's objectives.
Iran's Revolutionary Guard warned of a severe response, saying US military bases in the region are now vulnerable. And Tehran continues to insist that diplomacy is not an option while Israel continues its attacks. Julie Dager, Al Jazeera.
And we're going to be unpacking the latest developments and the international reaction shortly with our correspondents in Beijing, Moscow, Amman and Tehran and Washington, D.C. And in the last hour, we've been hearing more details on exactly what the U.S. deployed in Iran. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, has spoken at the Pentagon.
At approximately 6:40 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 2:10 a.m. Iran time, the lead B-2 dropped 2 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator weapons on the first of several aim points at Fordo. As the president stated last night, the remaining bombers then hit their targets as well, with a total of 14 MOPs dropped against 2 nuclear target areas. All 3 Iranian nuclear infrastructure targets were struck between 6:40 p.m. and 7:05 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, that's about 2:10 in the morning.
Alan Fisher's joining us now from Washington, D.C. Standing alongside General Dan Kane there was U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. And it was interesting because the general was giving a very sort of clear-cut and very concise interpretation of the mission itself. Pete Hegseth, however, was very strictly sticking to a line of this was to destroy or severely degrade Iran's nuclear program. It did not target Iranian troops or Iranian people. And he then went on to about several minutes of heaping praise on President Trump.
This is called Operation Midnight Hammer. It was put together using deception and used a massive amount, excuse me, of ordnance bombs, these 14 big so-called barrack buster bombs, carried by the B-2 bombers that were involved in this, and also a number of Tomahawk missiles which were fired from submarines. The Joint Chief of Staff was interesting in that he did not follow up on Donald Trump's line of complete obliteration. He said that there has to be an assessment, but he regards it very much as a success. And Pete Hegseth said that this was not an ongoing operation, but did warn that there could be more American action, echoing Donald Trump from Saturday night, if the Iranians were not to get back to the negotiating table. He said again that they were not seeking regime change, and J.D. Vance in the next hour will speak to an American TV network where he'll say that this was an attack on Iran's nuclear weapons facilities, not an attack on Iran's people. So what is interesting, though, is how Pete Hegseth, who has talked about how it was important to keep the circle of communication, this so tight, talked about the confidentiality of the operation when he himself has been at the centre of leaks over the operation in Yemen earlier this year. But he took time, as you say, to praise Donald Trump and said at one point he made the decision to go ahead with this operation when he believed that the Iranians were stonewalling at negotiations.
For the entirety of his time in office, President Trump has consistently stated for over 10 years that Iran must not get a nuclear weapon. Full stop. Thanks to President Trump's bold and visionary leadership and his commitment to peace through strength, Iran's nuclear ambitions have been obliterated. Many presidents have dreamed of delivering the final blow to Iran's nuclear program, and none could until President Trump.
They are, of course, talking about how there are public and private messages being sent to the Iranians at the moment, and that is significant and important. The first 48 hours are really important after an operation like this. The Americans will have their plans in place about what they hope will happen next, but speaking to someone late on Saturday night, he told me when you're involved in military operations, you've got to remember one very important thing. The person that you've just attacked also has a say in how this develops.
Alan, we should remember, of course, that Donald Trump is facing a lot of pressure because if you listen to Pete Hegseth, it sounds as though it was all very clear-cut, the decision-making, but he's got a lot of pressure within his supporters, particularly those who are convinced that the US should not be involved in foreign battles. And there are also questions, of course, about whether or not this was actually constitutional.
Well, there's a timeline of this. Donald Trump attacking Barack Obama when he was in the White House, saying that there's every possibility he's going to launch an assault on Iran to detract from his domestic problems. He criticised George W. Bush for getting involved in Iraq. He campaigned on no stupid, as he called them, Middle East wars. He said that they didn't want to get dragged into fighting something that could go on for years and years. He talked about how he would bring peace. 24 hours before he launched the attack in Iran, he was complaining how no one had given him a Nobel Peace Prize for the work he had done elsewhere. Is it constitutional? Probably yes, because the president can make a decision to carry out attacks of this kind. It does say in the Constitution that acts of war should be approved by Congress. So if this becomes sustained and goes on and prolonged, then he will have to go to Congress and seek their approval. In fact, there's going to be a number of motions placed in both houses of Congress on Monday calling for a vote on whether or not there should be further action, further conflict. What is interesting, though, is that in international law, Donald Trump probably crossed the line. You've got to show that there is an immediate threat to the United States to carry out this sort of attack. And we heard from the Director of National Intelligence in March, who said that the Iranians were not working towards a nuclear bomb. But as we know, when international law is broken, there are very rarely consequences for the likes of the United States.
Alan, thanks very much indeed. Alan Fisher there talking to us from Washington, D.C. Well, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps has responded to the nuclear site attack, saying the United States' repetition of past failed follies demonstrates strategic incompetence and disregard for the realities on the ground in the region. Instead of learning from repeated failures, Washington has effectively placed itself on the front lines of aggression by directly attacking peaceful installations. The flight locations of the planes participating in this aggression have been identified and monitored. The number, dispersion and size of US military bases in the region are not a strength, but have doubled their vulnerability. We're going to go to Ali Hashim, who's in the Iranian capital, Tehran. In many respects, that appears to be quite a muted response, in a sense, from the Revolutionary Guard Corps, given the intensity of the attacks that the US has been carrying out.
Well, yes, it's a response that's still keeping a distance from giving kind of a final warning. And this is due to many reasons and determinants. First of all, we heard from Abbas Araghchi, Iran's foreign minister, and he gave Iran's narrative over what happened yesterday, talking about blowing the negotiation tables. and of course being deceived by the United States as he described the action. But at the end, he said that all the cards are on the table, and that Iran is going to take the decision that suits it. And even when asked about the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, he condemned the situation and said that the United States is undermining the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Non-Proliferation Community. However, he did not say whether Iran is going to exit, despite the fact that in the past, the Iranians repeated on several occasions that anytime they are attacked by the United States, the first thing they're going to do is going to leave the NPT. Just as Foreign Minister Arakchi, the IRGC, as we just heard, kept a kind of a common or a general line with respect to holding the United States responsible, saying that the bases are under surveillance and that they would continue to launch attacks on Israel. President Pezeshkian, in his first reaction to the attack, also said that Israel dragged the United States into this conflict, and that Israel doesn't have the agency, doesn't have the courage, it doesn't have the capabilities to do any actions without the United States being with it. However, all these stances are still waiting to have a final decision by the Supreme National Security Council. That is the council that takes all the big decisions. And it's the council that have the president, the foreign ministry, the IRGC, and of course, everything that should be decided by the Supreme National Security Council should be signed by Iran's Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Ali Hashim there in the Iranian capital, Tehran. Ali, thank you very much indeed. Well, hours after the strikes, Iran fired another barrage of missiles into Israel. Dozens of people have been injured. Katia Lobozodoyan is the latest.
Iranian strikes began within hours of the U.S. joining the conflict. The damage is extensive, with sites in and around Haifa and Tel Aviv being bombed.
We're in the center of Israel, center division of Israel. A missile fire hit right inside of a building complex behind me.
Iran says it also targeted Israel's main airport, Ben Gurion.
Ben Gurion Airport, the regime's biological research center and alternative command and control centers, were hit during this wave by guided missiles equipped with maneuverable warheads. These were guided until the moment of impact and carried various types of high explosive destructive payloads.
As sirens blare, thousands of Israelis head to underground shelters like this one in Tel Aviv.
And I was really happy that, Trump has decided to act, finally. I think it will end the war. This is my hope. Maybe it is wishful thinking, but, I hope it will be fine.
Above ground, the damage is clear. This neighborhood in central Israel, one of several hit. Bolstered by support from the Trump administration, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has previously declared Israel is ready to continue its attacks against Iran for as long as it takes. Shortly after the U.S. strikes, Netanyahu spoke with Trump.
He congratulated me, he congratulated our army, he congratulated our people, and I congratulated him, the U.S. pilots and the American people. President Trump is fiercely leading the free world. He's a great friend of Israel, like no one before him.
Now, across the Middle East, many are questioning if U.S. strikes will mark the beginning of an end to the conflict or lead to an escalation and a broader regional conflict. Katia Lobozodoyan, Al Jazeera.
Brandon Smith joining us now from Amman. He's following events in Israel for us. As Katia was just pointing out, there are a lot of questions in Israel about where this is going to go next. What is the political reaction we've been seeing in Israel?
Well, Rob, there were 10 impact sites estimated from those Iranian missile strikes. And despite the scenes of devastation and rubble and destruction that Israelis emerged to on those sites, generally people are behind what the government is doing. Already billboards have appeared in Tel Aviv thanking Donald Trump for this. You heard Benjamin Netanyahu there thanking Donald Trump. This is something he's been trying to do for decades. And across the Israeli political spectrum, there has been backing for this. President Itzhak Herzog, he said that these are brave steps that serve the security and safety of the entire free world. It will help advance the urgent release of our hostages in Gaza, he said. And Yair Lapid, he's a leader, opposition leader, very significant opposition leader, frequent critic of Benjamin Netanyahu. He said tonight a nuclear arms race in the Middle East was averted. It was the right and correct thing for Israel to do, and Israel should now wrap this up because our main objectives have been achieved. And to give you an indication of the general sentiment in Israel, well, the stock market opened this morning in Tel Aviv with a record high. Rob.
Bernard, thanks very much indeed. Bernard Smith talking to us there from Amman. Well, Iran's foreign minister is now heading to Russia, where he says he's going to have talks with President Vladimir Putin on Monday. Yuri Shapovalov is joining us now from Moscow. So Iran's foreign minister doing essentially a tour of talks. We've seen him in Geneva. We've seen him in Istanbul. We're now going to be seeing him in Moscow as well, I would imagine. What is he likely to be demanding from Moscow? And also, what is the reaction in Russia to those strikes by the US?
Well, no doubt here the Iranian foreign minister is going to discuss this dangerous escalation, which will inevitably lead to a very big crisis for the entire region. According to the Russian president and the Russian side, Russia doesn't see the salvation of this crisis in military, and Russia has said that it won't be involved in this conflict militarily. Ex-President Dmitry Medvedev, who is now Russia's Security Council deputy chairman, has posted his assessment of what the Americans achieved with their night strikes on the nuclear facilities in Iran. According to Medvedev, not much. He wrote that Trump, who came as a peacemaker president, started a new war for the United States. The United States is drawn into a new conflict with the prospect of a ground operation. According to Medvedev, the critical infrastructure of the nuclear facilities apparently was not damaged or was only slightly damaged, meaning that the enrichment of nuclear materials will continue, and very much so the future production of nuclear weapons. Plus, a number of countries are ready to directly supply Iran with their nuclear weapons. That's according to the Russian side. Iran's political regime is preserved, and with a high degree of probability it will become stronger because the people of Iran are consolidating around their leadership now, including those who did not particularly support it in the past. And the absolute majority of countries in the world are against the actions of Israel and the United States. And now Israel is under attack and waiting for a stronger response from Iran. And also, of course, we've heard from a head of Russian Nuclear Energy Corporation, Rosatom, from Alexei Likhachov, and he has said that the U.S. strikes did not affect the part of Iran where the Bushehr nuclear power plant is located, and the situation there is currently more or less calm. But in the event of a threat to Russian personnel who is there, who works there, Russia will be ready to evacuate its staff. And earlier, Vladimir Putin also raised the issue of Russia's personnel there who work in Bushehr. According to the Russian president, Prime Minister Netanyahu actually agreed not to target those facilities, and so did Donald Trump. Russia has built a nuclear reactor in Bushehr, and according to Putin, Russia has signed contracts to build more reactors there. And despite the hostilities, the Russian employees continue to work there.
Yulia Shapovalova there in Moscow. Thank you very much indeed. Well, China strongly condemned the bombing of nuclear facilities in Iran, saying it violates international law. I'm going to go live to Katrina Yu in Beijing. China normally, to some degree, has good relations with Iran. Just talk to us about the kind of reaction that there is there to the U.S. strikes that have been happening in the last several hours.
Well,
Well, China released a brief statement on Sunday evening, but it didn't mince its words. It says it strongly condemns this attack by the U.S. on Iran's nuclear facilities, that this is a violation of the UN Charter of International Law, that this will only worsen the situation in the Middle East, and it's called for cool heads. It says that all parties must return to dialogue. It says that all parties need to return to ceasefire, particularly Israel, and it says that China stands ready to work with the international community to find a peaceful solution. Now, whether that means that Beijing is offering itself up as a mediator, that perhaps it did mediate a détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia in 2023. However, it's unlikely to be taken seriously, at least by Israel, because China is one of the countries that is quite close to Iran. It doesn't have a formal allegiance. It doesn't have any formal allies, let alone security allies. But it has called Iran a brother, a comprehensive strategic partner. And China has provided an economic lifeline to Iran through purchasing much of its crude oil. It provides about 15% of all of China's cheap imports of oil. And also, China does not, for example, want a regime change because it doesn't want to lose its influence in Iran and weaken its influence altogether in the region. Although Beijing will be increasingly concerned, watching this more than its influence there, about its security when it comes to energy, especially if Iran chooses to close the Strait of Hormuz. A lot of China's imports of oil from Saudi Arabia, its second largest provider, come through the strait, as well as its imports of oil, gas from Qatar and from the UAE. So China is watching this very closely. It's very anxious about the situation escalating into a greater conflict. The question, though, about whether Beijing will, in fact, itself participate or get involved, I think it's highly unlikely that we'll see any action from Beijing apart from these strong words, because Beijing remains very cautious when it comes to international conflicts and doesn't want to get itself embroiled in this conflict unless there's a very, very good reason for China.
Katrina, you there in Beijing. Katrina, thank you very much indeed. Abbas Aslani is a senior research fellow at the Center for Middle East Strategic Studies. He's joining us from our Tehran bureau. Obviously, a lot of attention being paid on the kind of response that Iran is likely to mount. How much of that do you think is going to be dependent on the level of damage that appears to have been caused by the US strikes? And of course, we have yet to get details of just what impact those strikes have had.
Rob, we have been hearing in the past from Iranian officials that when an aggression has happened, they have been stressing that the response is going to be a proportionate one. And Iran has tried to maintain that proportionality in different occasions. And this could be the case. And depending on the extent of the damage that Iran has suffered, I think its response could be qualitatively impacted. However, separately from the nuclear issue, Iran is also thinking of, reaching a point where it can somehow safeguard its security in order to make sure that these kind of aggressions will not happen again in future. So that is something independent from the level of the damages inflicted on those nuclear facilities. The second one could be somehow difficult, but the first one could be somehow within access, because this is not the first time Iran is facing damages at nuclear facilities, but it has been able to recover and compensate them in a very short time. This might be somehow taking a bit more time, but this is not going to be very long, and Iran can compensate that.
I was going to say there are efforts at diplomacy. There are no efforts at diplomacy going on. What we are seeing, of course, is Iran's foreign minister, who is doing a tour of talks, if you like, in Geneva and in Istanbul, and now, of course, in Russia as well. What do you think he's trying to achieve out of these talks, given the fact that from the get-go he has said that Iran's position as far as its nuclear program is concerned is not going to change?
Iran was at the negotiating table before, last week, and expected to be engaging with the American counterparts in Muscat, but Israel has disrupted the process. This week also it engaged with the Europeans, but I think now the approach Iran has toward Western parties is not based on, let's say, a positive one, because Tehran believes that those have been used as a cover in order to deceive Iran to, come with a surprise, with a military action. But Iran has been trying to engage all along with other capitals, including Beijing as well as Moscow, and the upcoming talks with the Russian president is expected to be an important one, because these two countries share similar concerns at some points, and they are going to exchange ideas that how they can proceed within this situation. And Iranian foreign minister also, within that political context, has been trying to reach out to different counterparts since the outset of the Israeli aggression, then followed by American, let's say, attacks on nuclear facilities. Iranian foreign minister has been trying to talk and hold, discussions with foreign officials. Part of, in addition to military response and retaliation, Iran is eyeing also political coordination to get condemnation against Israeli and American actions. So, and this could create a, let's say, grounds or solidify Iran's legitimate right for self-defense in order to respond against Israel and the United States. And countries like Russia are a member to the United Nations Security Council, a permanent member. So having their support and backing when there is a session at the Security Council could be important for Tehran.
Abbas Aslani, we appreciate you giving us that analysis. Thank you very much indeed for being with us on Al Jazeera. Well, joining me on set is Mohanad Saloom. He's an assistant professor in critical security studies at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Good to have you back. I know you've been with us over the last few hours or so. As our guest was just saying, Abbas Aslani there, that Iran is saying that its response is going to be proportionate to the attacks that have happened. We still don't know yet exactly how successful or not those attacks have been. Given your background as a specialist in critical security studies, what's your assessment of whether or not these attacks have actually done what they set out to do?
Well, the U.S. Has been saying that the attacks were very much effective and they have achieved their declared goals. That might well be true. But what we are looking at is what is the strategic goal behind these attacks in the first place? The United States wants Iran to come back to the negotiating table. Actually, they want Iran to accept some of the conditions, which are to let the inspectors of the IAEA have unconditional, unrestricted access to these sites. And this request is actually backed up by the report just before this confrontation has started, actually 2 days before that, condemning Iran, that is saying that Iran is not cooperating with the Atomic Energy Association. So what we are looking at here is the United States hitting these sites, saying that we will set them back, we will degrade them, but the ultimate goal is to have inspectors on the ground. What Iran can do in response, that is a different story, but what we are looking at is what are the strategic goals behind these attacks. My assessment is that there is no military solution for this. So we don't know exactly what happened on the ground now. I think we would know eventually, but what is the end result? Because Iran might claim, and they have already been claiming since the early morning, that actually most of the enriched uranium has already been transferred somewhere else. And this might well be true or not. So there is no way to verify this. And the United States is pushing Iran to come back to the negotiating table. I think it is very clear from the United States rhetoric, because the president himself said right after the attacks that now this is over. We want Iran back to the negotiating table. He said it's peace. It's time for peace now.
Having said all of that, there seems to be absolutely no incentive on the part of Iran to get back to the negotiating table because of the attacks that have just gone on. Abbas Karachi earlier on today in a statement was saying, well, actually, there's no point in us even talking about it if all the U.S. believes is in attacking us and in violence. There's also been a suggestion that one of the things that Iran could do is remove itself from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And if it did that, to what extent does that essentially remove it entirely from the process of checking? And is that another piece of leverage essentially gone from the West and from the IAEA when it comes to Iran's nuclear program?
In rhetoric, it's very easy to say that. But what are the mechanism of exiting the NPT? I don't see Iran doing that. I think they are threatening with this. They have other threats as well in terms of military action, in terms of diplomacy. They are going to Russia. They might go to China as well. But these will not be effective. I think both parties are speaking different languages. So the Iranian side is saying that there is no incentive for us to actually go back and sit to the negotiating table. The Americans are saying, and the Israelis actually know, we are, you're under military pressure, and this could escalate, and the safety and security and stability of Iran is under threat, and maybe to avert a wider conflict, you should go back to the negotiating table. I want to be very clear, and this is about this, because this is the language the United States and Israel is speaking. They are saying that the military action is actually aimed at degrading the nuclear sites, weakening Iran, and also forcing Iran to come back to the negotiating table. Iran is saying we are going to resist and we are going to strike back because we are in self-defense. But it is not as easy as that. And I think Iran is weighing its options in terms of diplomatic channels, but also they want a way back. They want somebody to help them back to the negotiating table with dignity. Iran, after all, is a medium-sized country. They play a crucial role in the stability of the region, and I don't think they would go back with their hand twisted by force. I think there should be a mediating party. Russia is not offering that. Maybe China can offer that, or maybe another country in the region.
Mohammed, stay with us because there's a lot more I want to talk to you about this. But for now, the UN nuclear watchdog chief Rafael Grossi has posted on X saying he's calling an emergency meeting of the IAEA Board of Governors after the US military strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. The off-site radiation levels in Iran are not reported to have increased, but the IAEA says it will provide more information if it becomes available. Well, Jean-Marc Richley is the head of the global risk at the Geneva Centre for Security Policy. He's a specialist in contemporary warfare and international security. He's joining us from Geneva. Thank you very much indeed for giving us your time, sir. I want to ask you the same question. Actually, I just asked our guest here, Mohammed, earlier on. What's your assessment, do you think, of the way that the US has carried out these strikes and the possible effectiveness of them?
Well, from an operation perspective, the U.S. operation was flawless. They used deception. They hit at the target. Still to see what are the final damage assessment of these strikes. But from a military perspective, I think this is a success. Now, it's about the political objective, and the political objective was to bring back Iran to the negotiation table. Will that work or not? Everything is still now hangs in the balance.
I want to ask you about what your considerations are with regard to the possible reaction that Iran is going to have, the way that it might respond to this, and the methods that it might use to do that.
Well, Iran faces a spectrum of possible reaction. One is not to do anything, and that would be really bad for its reputation and also for internally. To striking back at U.S. interests or U.S. assets. These are the two spectrums. Probably there will be actions that are in between, but the issue with Iran is finding a way to not bring the American back in terms of the military, because of course, if the U.S. military unleashes its full potential, Iran stands no chance. So now, if we can look back in the past for any lessons, when Qasem Soleimani was executed by the United States, Iran retaliated by bombing U.S. base in Iran, but in Iraq, but before that, they also warned the Americans. Will they try to do something similar? That is possible, but for now, it's very difficult to say.
Jean-Marc, hang around just for a second, because I want to come back to our guest here in the studio, Mohammed Saloom, because we've been talking about the strategy behind a lot of this. Now, Mohammed, in the earlier press conference that we heard, that was done by the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was also there. General Kane was asked a very specific question about what the Iranian retaliation might be, what his anticipation was. But in the question was a very specific point that was made about Iraq significantly. And I just wondered what your assessment is of why Iraq particularly might be a target for Iran in this.
Because Israel has already weakened some of the militant groups in Lebanon. Syria is actually off the map now in terms of alliances with Iran. The Houthis have already signed an agreement by mediation from a regional actor that they would not target the U.S. assets or even block the maritime routes. So the only one left that has, they can actually strike U.S. bases are the Iraqi militant groups. I don't see that happening because they're restricted by the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government has a very complicated relationship with the United States, and the Iraqi economy is very much linked to the U.S. influence. So if they do that, and the U.S. has already warned that if Iraqi militias would target U.S. bases or U.S. diplomatic missions in Iraq, the retaliation would be both military and economic. I don't see Iraq tolerating that. So the Iraqi government is trying to make sure that this doesn't happen. So if it does happen, it would be very much limited. But they do have the options because the U.S. bases are scattered all over Iraq. They are in the Kurdish area, in Baghdad, in Anbar, and other cities. So they might be a potential target, but I don't see that happening just yet.
Mohammed Saloom, as always, we appreciate you giving us that breakdown. Thank you very much indeed. I want to go back to Jean-Marc Richling, who's at the head of global risk at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. As I was mentioning, he is a specialist in contemporary warfare and international security. With regard to what the options that are on the table and the way that Iran responds, if, for example, Iran chooses to respond in the short term with some sort of missile strike, it has in the past, of course, developed a cyber attack program, which to some degree has been effective. In the past, it has also taken hostages. It has been active in terrorist activities as well. How likely is it, do you think, that rather than having a focused attack using missiles, it might choose a different method to respond?
Yeah, it's everything is on the agenda. They can indeed use the ballistic missiles capabilities, but they have been degraded, especially middle and long range capabilities. So they still have short range ballistic missiles capabilities that would basically be able to hit U.S. bases in the Gulf. But they could also, as they did in the past, use sea mining and now naval drones to try to block the Strait of Hormuz in order to have an impact on global oil prices. But then, of course, they could use also a terrorist attack against American or Israeli assets in the world, especially in the West. And they could still try to use the proxies, the surrogates. The Houthis this morning mentioned that they were ready to hit U.S. warships and ships that would cross the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and navigating through the Red Sea. So they have a panel of options. The problem is really the answer, the response from the United States. And if there is a response from the United States, then it will be probably much more violent. So overall, the Iranians are in a very weak position for negotiation because compared to 2 or 3 years ago, their hands, if you want, have weakened quite dramatically with the removal of the surrogates and proxies in the region and the weakening of the ballistic missiles capabilities.
It's really interesting to get the benefit of your expertise in this. Jean-Marc Richling, we appreciate it, sir. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Just before President Trump delivered his address denouncing strikes on Iran, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu issued a video statement. He said history will record that the U.S. acted to deny Iran the most dangerous of weapons.
Congratulations, President Trump. Your bold decision to target Iran's nuclear facilities with the awesome and righteous might of the United States will change history. In Operation Rising Lion, Israel has done truly amazing things. But in tonight's action against Iran's nuclear facilities, America has been truly unsurpassed. It has done what no other country on earth could do. History will record that President Trump acted to deny the world's most dangerous regime the world's most dangerous weapons. His leadership today has created a pivot of history that can help lead the Middle East and beyond to a future of prosperity and peace. President Trump and I often say, peace through strength. First comes strength, then comes peace. And tonight, President Trump and the United States acted with a lot of strength. President Trump, I thank you. The people of Israel thank you. The forces of civilization thank you. God bless America. God bless Israel. And may God bless our unshakable alliance, our unbreakable faith.
Yossi Merkelberg is a senior consulting fellow at Chatham House. He's also an expert in Israeli politics. He's joining us from London. So thank you very much indeed for being with us. There seems to be some consensus, at least amongst the US, the Trump administration and Benjamin Netanyahu, that these US strikes have managed to essentially destroy or obliterate, I believe is the word, Iran's nuclear program. But if we go back to the press conference that was held earlier, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, was a lot more careful about the way that he was phrasing things. He was not suggesting that things had been obliterated, simply that they had been severely degraded. Do you think that Israel's leadership is being too enthusiastic when it says that essentially the US has denied Iran a nuclear weapon?
Good afternoon. I think usually politicians are less careful with their words than generals. Generals, military people try to look to hard evidence. Politicians and Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu more than most using rhetoric in order to enhance their base and their political position. You need to really assess the situation through information gathering, intelligence, to see how much damage was caused. It's too early to know the exact damage, but we can assume that whatever happened, Iranian nuclear program, definitely the military side of it, has been degraded seriously, and it will take at least a few years for it to recover, if ever.
Some of our guests have been telling us that Israelis are feeling safer because they regard Iran's nuclear program as having been destroyed, the threat being removed. Nevertheless, does that mean that Israel is likely to start easing off, if you like, on its attacks in Iran? Or do you think that we're going to see a continuation? And if we do, what are the risks, do you think, that this is going to turn into essentially an open-ended conflict from Israel?
Not necessarily that you will bring to immediate end of the war. Bear in mind that for a quarter of a century now, Israeli people are being fed that Iran is an existential threat. And there is an element of truth of that, but always exaggerated, and also exaggerated in the sense that there is no diplomatic solution to that. There is only military one. So there is a build-up here of almost an whole generation in Israel that see Iran as an existential threat. The only way to deal with it eventually is by using the kind of military force that we have seen in the last 9-10 days. And now the question is, what is Israel after? Is it only about degrading the nuclear military capabilities of Iran, or there is a much bigger agenda to reduce Iran's ability to challenge Israel in other fronts as well? And we saw how Iran supported Hamas, Hezbollah, and other movements challenging Israel, and possibly, as if it's enough to quote some senior official Israel, looking for a regime change and maybe even restore back the monarchy in Iran.
I mean, do you think that there is a feeling in Israel that people, as a result of this, are likely to be safer? Or do you think, like, given what we've been talking about with our other guests in terms of the nature and possibly long-term responses that Iran could have, that the threats to Israelis and possibly their origins might simply just change?
I think it is premature to think that as successful as this military operation now with the help of the United States been successful, that this ensures Israel's security. At the end of the day, Israel's security is not going to be achieved only on the negotiation table, whether it's with the Palestinians, Syria, and eventually to look into Iran being brought back into the fold in many ways. We have seen progress, for instance, between Iran and Saudi Arabia over the last 2-3 years. Can be negotiation over nuclear with the United States and the other P5 plus one, and to an extent to look into what the JCPOA represented, the ability to achieve an agreement that stops developing a nuclear military capability in Iran, but through diplomatic means. But it has to be a better agreement that can be verified, that inspections are done better. But, we can learn from that. Only using military force not going to ensure Israel's security.
Yossi Mechaber is a senior consulting fellow at Chatham House. We appreciate it, as always. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Medical services in Gaza say ambulances have stopped operating in Gaza City because of Israel's fuel ban. At least 6 Palestinians have been killed in overnight attacks during an internet blackout, which has been lasting 5 hours. Among them, a married couple whose apartment north of Useret was hit. Hospital sources say 29 people have been killed on Sunday, including 6 while waiting for aid. Hani Mahmoud's joining us live from Gaza City. Hani, of course, world's attention at the moment on Israel and Iran, but Israeli attacks carry on in Gaza.
Yes, Rob, and unfortunately and tragically enough, another family been wiped off the civil registry. We're talking about a husband and wife, and their 2 daughters were killed inside their residential home in a Nusayrat refugee camp. The eyewitnesses describe a massive explosion that shook the very foundation of the nearby buildings, not only destroying this residential home, and the victims had to be pulled from underneath the rubble, but many of the homes in the vicinity of the bombed site, the bombed home, where sustained the severe damage, including broken glasses and many of the debris that fell on displaced people who are sheltering with other families inside the area. This is one of many of the attacks that have been taking place since early hours of this morning, and the death toll keeps increasing, either from people who are attacked directly by today's drone attacks or the fighter jets, or by those who sustain injuries from the past attacks. And as doctors describe, that there is a consistent injuries influx into the hospital by the flying shrapnels, whether the small ones or the small pieces, or the larger one that pierce into the bodies and cause severe bleeding to the victims. And by the time they get to the hospital, it's too late to save their lives, as they lost a huge quantity of blood. At the same time, there are these reports of ambulance convoys that have stopped due to the shortage of fuel. This will all exacerbate the already dire situations in the hospital and its ability to respond to calls for help and appeals from bomb site. It will definitely impede the work of paramedics that is already challenged by months of devastation and destruction. Meanwhile, the situations in terms of humanitarian level continue to worsen by the hour. We're just in an area where a lot of displaced people are in the vicinity of where we are operating from, and we have been, for the past hours, we had more than one time people asking us about whether water tanks are going to be in the area, where we just discovered that these people haven't had any water supplies for the past 24 hours, and it's expected to continue for another day, as there are many of the water supplies and water reservoirs have been destroyed by the Israeli military, as well as many of the tanks, the water tanks, are unable to operate due to the shortage of fuel, or the lack of fuel for that matter, that stops these trucks from operating, let alone the station, the desalination stations, to operate properly.
Hani, we can hear the drones that are flying above you, and of course those are Israeli drones that very often are a precursor to attacks. So we're very conscious of your safety there and that of the team. At the same time, I just want to quickly ask you about the level of aid that people are getting, because we do understand, of course, that people are still being killed as they try to get aid.
Well, unfortunately, that has become the daily routine. It's started to be a daily struggle for people, waking up early in the morning or spending late hours at night waiting for aid trucks. But now they have to endure much of the violence taking place at these centers, including Rafah or the Netzarim corridor or the eastern part of Khan Yunis. Is something that is similar. If anyone is familiar with the Hunger Game series, it's similar to it happening on the ground. People showing up at late hours, they wait for the food to be distributed, large crowds, but it's controlled. It's controlled by the heavy military that is at present at the site. It's controlled by the high level of violence that is inflicted on the hungry and displaced population seeking aid. And if you're lucky to pick up one parcel or one bag of flowers, if in the 20-minute window, you are very lucky. It means the world for you. But for the most part, many of the people are unable to do this. They go back without any of the food. Others, they remain at the center because they were shot. They are shot and killed, and they stay there until a coordination is made to remove the bodies. That's the situation for many of the hungry Palestinians.
Hani Mahmoud talking to us there from Gaza City. Hani, thank you very much. Hamid Jahama is country director at Plan International Aid Organizations. He says Gaza is in danger of being forgotten about during the attacks on Iran.
It's very important to keep eyes on Gaza. What is happening today in Gaza is a manufactured catastrophe, and it is a continuous violation of the international humanitarian law. We see today that the Israeli scheme for the delivery of limited supplies shuts down completely the UN-led humanitarian operations, and it basically replaces it with militarized bubbles, which are basically Israeli-controlled zones monitored by private contractors. We're actually seeing a deliberate strategy to control, displace, and dehumanize civilians inside Gaza, particularly children, women, and people with disabilities who cannot access the very much needed life-saving assistance. One of our partners told us that there's a widow with 6 children who tried to access those sites out of desperation for food, and she ended up going back home with no food and with a traumatizing experience, and decided never to return to those sites because she didn't want to leave her 6 children without the last surviving caregiver. This is the reality today for all children, for all women and girls inside Gaza today.
You're watching Al Jazeera. Here's a reminder of the latest developments in our breaking news coverage of the Israel-Iran conflict. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says the strikes on Iran's nuclear sites were an incredible success. During a Pentagon briefing, President Trump ordered the strikes on the Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan plants, saying it was to prevent any nuclear threat from Tehran. Iran's foreign minister says the U.S. has betrayed diplomacy by attacking its 3 main nuclear sites. Abbas Araghchi says negotiations are no longer an option, as the Americans only understand threat and force. Iran has retaliated to the U.S. attacks by firing missiles into Israel. They struck northern and central areas, including the cities of Tel Aviv and Haifa. I want to take a closer look at the weapons used in the U.S. attacks. Alex Gutopoulos explains.
Several B-2 stealth bombers flew over 13,000 kilometers from the base in Missouri in the United States, being refueled in the air before dropping the GBU-57, known as the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, or MOP, on targets in Iran. The heaviest conventional weapon in the US arsenal, it weighs in at 13,600 kilos and is designed to destroy underground hardened bunkers and facilities, piercing up to 60 meters of concrete and rock before exploding. Most of the weapon is hardened casing, the mop punching to the required depth before detonating its 2,400 kilo warhead, with the idea that the facility is destroyed. Only the B-2 stealth bomber can carry them, and even then it can only carry 2. All but invisible to radar, the plane is designed to fly anywhere in the world, penetrate enemy airspace undetected, and drop its payload, all in a matter of hours.
Former Israeli diplomat Alon Pincus says any expansion of the conflict depends on Iran's response.
It's obviously not an escalation because it follows the pattern of the last 10 days. I mean, the only outstanding event was the U.S. attack. So in terms of the Israeli-Iranian tit-for-tat or exchange of salvos, there was no escalation here. As for the retaliation, well, you have to assume that it was a retaliatory strike for the American attack. But then again, I go back to the previous point. You need not necessarily have the American attack for the Iranians to respond to Israeli attacks yesterday. So in that respect, it's neither escalatory nor indirect retaliation. Israel doesn't know how Iran will retaliate, how Iran will respond, the scale and the scope of any Iranian action against either U.S. forces or the Straits of Hormuz or the Arab Gulf countries. Any of those targets is plausible. If that happens, that of course will be entailed by an American response. And before you know it, we have a major expansion of the war. So Israel is now looking to see and examine two things: whether or not the Iranians directly respond to America, thus dragging the U.S. into a retaliatory strike, and then we're into a cycle of escalation, or not. That's one thing. And the second thing is whether or not in the next few days you're going to hear rhetoric in Jerusalem. Well, you're already hearing that in Jerusalem, but also in Washington, about regime change.
Hassan Ahmadian is an assistant professor at the University of Tehran. He says the U.S. is alienating itself, but Iran's been playing by the rules.
Well, the Iranians are playing by the book. The foreign minister spoke about a session that needs to be convened at the Security Council. They are, trying to isolate the United States legally, internationally, and provided that, and as the experience suggests, nothing will really happen there, the Iranians will take action on their own. And this action can take different forms. They already launched an unprecedented attack on Israel as a retaliation for its aggression, but also they ratchet up the attack, I think, as a response also to a U.S. doing Israeli bidding when it comes to attacking Iran's nuclear sites. Moving forward, I mean, the attack seems to be choreographed and given the info before attacking to Iran indicates a U.S. Different approach this time around, and the Iranians will take that into account when responding to the United States. And I think the Iranians have indicated that they have a right to respond. Now, how and when, it's really still not clear. I think the Iranians will have to do a reaction, because non-action is not an option. For the United States might go even further in its assault on Iran.
Hello, I'm Rob Matheson. This is Al Jazeera, live from Doha, with the latest developments after the U.S. strikes on Iran. Iran is accusing the U.S. of betraying international diplomacy by attacking 3 of its nuclear sites.
We were in the middle of talks and negotiation with Europeans. Happened only 2 days ago in Geneva, when this time Americans decided to blow it up.
Overnight, President Trump ordered stealth bombers to strike at the heart of Iran's nuclear infrastructure.
The lead B-2 dropped 2 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator weapons on the first of several aim points at Fordo.
Hours after the strikes, Iran fires another barrage of missiles against Israel, injuring dozens of people. And also ahead, an internet blackout ends in Gaza, while Israeli forces kill another 29 Palestinians. Iran's foreign minister is accusing the United States of betraying diplomacy. Abbas Araghchi made the comments after the U.S. military's attack on Iran's 3 key nuclear sites. Araghchi says diplomacy is no longer an option because Americans only understand the language of threat and force. Julie Deger begins our coverage.
The aftermath of strikes that could reshape the region. The U.S. military says it's bombed 3 of Iran's key nuclear sites, Fordo, Natanz and Esfahan. US President Donald Trump described it as necessary to prevent Iran's development of a nuclear weapon, despite the International Atomic Agency and his own intelligence chief saying there's no evidence to support that allegation.
It is an outrageous, grave and unprecedented violation of the fundamental principles of the Charter of the United Nations and international law. The warmongering and lawless administration in Washington is solely and fully responsible for the dangerous consequences and far-reaching implications of its act of aggression.
President Trump claimed Iran's major nuclear facilities had been totally obliterated, a statement denied by the parliamentary member for Qom, where Fordo is based. Qasem Ravanbash said damage was not as severe as reported in US media and was only above ground and could be restored. And the US attack legitimized the use of military operations against its own forces in the region. Iran's foreign minister says Washington has crossed a very big red line.
While President Trump was elected on a platform of putting an end to America's costly involvement of forever wars in our part of the world, he has betrayed not only Iran by abusing our commitment to diplomacy, but also deceived his own voters by submitting to the wishes of a wanted war criminal who has grown accustomed to exploiting the lives and wealth of American citizens to further the Israeli regime's objectives.
Iran's Revolutionary Guard warned of a severe response, saying US military bases in the region are now vulnerable. And Tehran continues to insist that diplomacy is not an option while Israel continues its attacks. Julie Deger, Al Jazeera.
Going to be unpacking the latest developments and the international reaction shortly with our correspondents in Beijing, Moscow, Amman and Washington, D.C. First, we're going to be learning more details on the U.S. attacks. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, has been speaking at the Pentagon.
At approximately 6:40 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 2:10 a.m. Iran time, the lead B-2 dropped 2 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator weapons on the first of several aim points at Fordo. As the president stated last night, the remaining bombers then hit their targets as well, with a total of 14 MOPs dropped against 2 nuclear target areas. All 3 Iranian nuclear infrastructure targets were struck between 6:40 p.m. and 7:05 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, that's about 2:10 in the morning.
Alan Fisher is joining us now from Washington, D.C. Alan, General Kane, when he was making his statements, very measured analysis of the attack. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, keen to stress it was a very limited attack, but he did spend several minutes praising Donald Trump.
That's right. He says it's limited, but America's capabilities are not. And so there's a warning there to Iran that they want to see them back at the negotiating table. There was certainly a moment Pete Hegseth said when Donald Trump decided that he was going to order the attack, when he realized that the Iranians were, in his words, stonewalling the negotiations, that they weren't going to budge and diplomatic measures weren't going to bring anything new to the table. Certainly, the Americans are hailing the operation as a huge success. They said it was carried out by stealth and also by using a huge amount of their weapons arsenal and a huge number of people just involved in the logistics. But Pete Hegseth also added that he didn't think that this was a war to change the regime. This was an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, not an attack on its people. Certainly, there'll be an interesting 48 hours now until we see how the Iranians react. But the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said effectively it would be a mistake if Iran wants to take further action. But Donald Trump had made the decision to do this after saying that it was going to take 2 weeks before he made a final call. In the end, it took just 2 days. But as you say, Pete Hegseth was very effusive in his praise for the president and this decision.
For the entirety of his time in office, President Trump has consistently stated for over 10 years that Iran must not get a nuclear weapon. Full stop. Thanks to President Trump's bold and visionary leadership and his commitment to peace through strength, Iran's nuclear ambitions have been obliterated. Many presidents have dreamed of delivering the final blow to Iran's nuclear program, and none could until President Trump.
Pete Hegseth says that Iran's nuclear capability has been obliterated. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was a bit more measured. He said they're still waiting for the full intelligence report. It'll be interesting to see what does happen over the next 48 hours, and military plans will be put in place. But as one military analyst told me late on Saturday night, you can have these plans, but you've got to remember the person that you've just bombed also has a voice in what happens next.
Yeah, and if you listen to U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, you get the impression that the decision-making process leading up to these attacks was very clear-cut. But it kind of wasn't. There were other things that Donald Trump must have been taking into consideration, not least the fact that there is pressure for parts of his supporters who do not believe that the U.S. should be anywhere near the Middle East, and there are questions growing about whether or not this was constitutional.
Well, in the American Constitution, Congress has the right to declare war. But many presidents have launched attacks like this. I mean, I can think going back to Clinton when attacks like this have been carried out. So this is probably not against the Constitution. But he will have to go to Congress if this becomes a sustained operation, if it becomes effectively a war. Certainly, we're going to see in both chambers of Congress on Monday resolutions tabled that say they want an end to any conflict and also want to see negotiations to take place with the Iranians, something that Donald Trump wants as well. But you're right, Donald Trump has a problem because, of course, he campaigned on the fact that the US had been involved in so many needless, pointless, he called them stupid Middle East wars. And now he's got to convince many of his followers that he hasn't taken America into another one.
Alan, thanks very much indeed for that breakdown. Alan Fisher there, talking to us from Washington, D.C. Hours after the strikes, Iran fired another barrage of missiles into Israel. Dozens of people have been injured. Katia Lopez-Orion has the details.
Iranian strikes began within hours of the U.S. joining the conflict. The damage is extensive, with sites in and around Haifa and Tel Aviv being bombed.
We're in the center of Israel, center division of Israel. A missile fire hit right inside of a building complex behind me.
Iran says it also targeted Israel's main airport, Ben Gurion.
Ben Gurion Airport, the regime's biological research center and alternative command and control centers, were hit during this wave by guided missiles equipped with maneuverable warheads. These were guided until the moment of impact and carried various types of high explosive destructive payloads.
As sirens blare, thousands of Israelis head to underground shelters like this one in Tel Aviv.
And I was really happy that, Trump has decided to act, finally. I think it will end the war. This is my hope. Maybe it is wishful thinking, but I mean, I hope it will be fine.
Above ground, the damage is clear. This neighborhood in central Israel, one of several hit. Bolstered by support from the Trump administration, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has previously declared Israel is ready to continue its attacks against Iran for as long as it takes. Shortly after the U.S. strikes, Netanyahu spoke with Trump.
He congratulated me, he congratulated our army, he congratulated our people, and I congratulated him, the U.S. pilots and the American people. President Trump is fiercely leading the free world. He's a great friend of Israel, like no one before him.
Now, across the Middle East, many are questioning if U.S. strikes will mark the beginning of an end to the conflict or lead to an escalation and a broader regional conflict. Hacia Lopez-Odoyan, Al Jazeera.
And Brandon Smith joining us now from Amman. Some very serious attacks being carried out by Iran on Israel there. We've just been seeing some of the pictures. Talk us through what you know about those attacks, but also about the political reaction we've been seeing in Israel.
Rob, 25 missiles fired in 2 waves today from Iran to Israel, and according to the Israeli authorities, about 10 impact sites. And the Israelis living in those impact sites emerged from their shelters to scenes of considerable destruction and devastation, notably in Tel Aviv and in Haifa, but that has not put Israelis off supporting what their government is doing, and its politicians are emboldened. This is something that Benjamin Netanyahu, attacking Iran and its nuclear capabilities, has been wanting to do almost since the start of his political career, and now he's been able to do it. And just before Israel launched its attacks on Iran last week, he looked in real trouble, and there was even a possibility of Israel going to elections that he would almost certainly have lost. Well, now, for example, Yair Lapid, an opposition leader, is saying it was the right and correct thing for Israel to do, and he says he doesn't have a problem with Netanyahu enjoying his moment. Israel's President Yitzhak Herzog, he said this brave step serves the security and safety of the entire free world and will help advance the urgent release of our hostages in Gaza. There's even a couple of billboards have appeared in Tel Aviv thanking Donald Trump. And as an idea of the general Israeli sentiment over how this is going, well, the stock market closed today on a record high at 1.8% and marking 8% gains in the past week for Israel's stocks.
Well, the stock market might be high and the politicians might be feeling confident. How are the Israeli people feeling? Because, of course, they're the ones still having to get into the shelters when the Iranian missiles fly over.
Yeah, people are supporting what the government has done. The sentiment is in favour of the government, despite those images you see of that destruction from those missile impact sites. The last bit of polling a couple of days ago put at more than 80% of Jewish Israelis were in favour of the actions their government was taking. While Netanyahu might be trying to recover his popularity, he still sort of remains personally unpopular, even though the Israelis are behind these latest attempts to destroy Iran's nuclear capability. Despite that, Israelis rally around the flag, and they felt threatened by Iran for decades. Iran, a country that has vowed Israel's destruction, so Israelis are backing what their government is doing.
Bernard Smith in Amman there, checking what's happening in Israel for us. Bernard, thank you. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps has responded to the nuclear site attack, saying the United States' repetition of past failed follies demonstrates strategic incompetence and disregard for the realities on the ground in the region. Instead of learning from repeated failures, Washington has effectively placed itself on the front lines of aggression by directly attacking peaceful installations. The flight locations of the planes participating in this aggression have been identified and monitored. The number, dispersion and size of U.S. military bases in the region are not a strength, but they've doubled their vulnerability. Let's go to Ali Hashem, who's in the Iranian capital, Tehran. It's an interesting tone of that statement from the Revolutionary Guard, isn't it? Because given the nature of the attacks that we've seen from the U.S. in Iran, some would say that that is a fairly muted response, and it doesn't really give us an indication of how Iran is likely to retaliate.
Well, Rob, indeed, for now, the Iranian stances over the Israeli-American joint attack on the nuclear sites this morning we can put them in the category of vague and ambiguous. This is due to the fact that for now there is no clear direction from the Supreme National Security Council with respect to how and what's the scope of the retaliation going to be. The National Security Council that has the Foreign Ministry, the IRGC, several ministries within, and of course is presided by the President of the Republic, Masoud Pezeshkian, is the one who's going to give such direction that is going to be approved and confirmed by the Supreme Leader. So that's why we heard these, let me say, general lines by the IRGC, also some general lines by the Foreign Minister and President Pezeshkian, who was just minutes ago participating in a popular gathering in the Revolution Square, Inqilab, where many people went and showed solidarity. And of course, there were a lot of chants and slogans that are against the United States of America and Israel, given today's attacks and the war that has been going on for the past few days that Israel launched on Iran.
And Ali, a lot of the speculation, of course, about the level of damage that the US has inflicted on these three sites in Iran. What are you hearing there about what kind of impact these attacks have had?
Well, for now, there's no clear or credible reports on how much dire is the situation in these three sites. However, given what the Americans are saying, the official lines coming from the Pentagon or the White House, they're reflecting an amount of destruction that's big. But given the fact there are no radiations, given the fact we are hearing from the Iranian nuclear agency and the IAEA that there are no radiations out, and that, according to some media reports, Iran has already removed the stockpile of uranium, the enriched uranium, from the sites to other secure sites. Also, several amount of technology that is inside these sites were removed, given the fact some equipments could be removed. Satellite pictures showed more than 20 trucks over the past couple of days, the 20th and the 21st of June, moving from Fordo and outside. Amouage Media, which is a UK-based media, said that the United States informed the Iranians in advance, something similar to the scenario of Iran informing the United States in advance of its retaliation to the killing of General Soleimani.
Ali, thanks very much indeed for the breakdown. Ali Hashem there in the Iranian capital, Tehran. Well, Iran's foreign minister is now heading to Russia, where he says he's going to have talks with President Vladimir Putin on Monday. Yuli Shapovalov is joining us now from Moscow. What is he hoping to achieve, and what is also the reaction in Moscow to the US strikes in Iran?
Well, no doubt the Iranian foreign minister and the Russian leadership are going to discuss ways out of the situation. But as we know, President Vladimir Putin has said that Russia will not get involved in the conflict and won't contribute militarily as Russia continues its own military operation in Ukraine. Talking about Russia's obligations in accordance with the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement between Russia and Iran, in case of an aggression against Russia or Iran, neither one of them should take sides with the aggressor. Plus, Russia thinks this conflict doesn't have a military solution. The Russian Foreign Ministry has strongly condemned the US attacks, saying that their consequences, including radiological ones, have yet to be assessed. Russia's ex-president and current Security Council Deputy Chairman Dmitry Medvedev has posted his reaction, his assessment of what the Americans achieved with their nice strikes on the nuclear facilities in Iran. According to him, not much have been achieved. Medvedev wrote that Trump, who came as a peacemaker president, started a new war for the United States with the prospect of a ground operation, even though we've just heard from Vice President Vance that the US is not going to deploy boots on the ground to continue to go ahead with the ground operation. According to Dmitry Medvedev, the critical infrastructure of the nuclear facilities apparently was not heavily damaged, which means that the enrichment of nuclear materials will continue there, and very much so the future production of nuclear weapons. Plus, a number of countries are ready to directly supply Iran with their nuclear weapons. Iran's political regime is still there, and with a high degree of probability it has become even stronger because the people are consolidating around their leadership right now, including those who did not particularly support it recently. The absolute majority of countries in the world are against the actions of Israel and the United States. Therefore, the US has received negative feedback from them. Plus, Israel is now under attack again, and there is no end in sight for the warring parties to stop what's going on now. And as I said, the consequences of the US strikes, radiological consequences, have to be assessed. And we've heard from head of Russian nuclear energy corporation Rosatom, Alexei Likhachov. He has said that US strikes did not affect the part of Iran where the Bushehr nuclear power plant is located. So obviously the safety and security of the Russian personnel there is going to be discussed here in Moscow tomorrow as well.
Yulia, thank you very much indeed. Yulia Shapovalova there talking to us from Moscow. China strongly condemned the bombing of nuclear facilities in Iran, saying it violates international law. We're going to go to Katrina Yu in Beijing. Russia, obviously, has very close links with Iran. So does China, of course. Talk to us about the kind of reaction there to what's been happening.
Well, China has released a brief statement, but it was unequivocal. It has strongly condemned these attacks by the US on Iranian nuclear facilities. It says that this is a violation of international law, of the UN Charter, that it only worsens the situation in the Middle East. It's called on all parties to return to dialogue, to push for a ceasefire, particularly Israel. And China says it stands ready to work with the international community toward finding a peaceful solution. Now, Beijing is watching this situation very closely because it's anxious for two reasons. The first is that it's a relatively close partner of Iran. It's called it a comprehensive strategic partner. It is its largest trading partner. It purchases about 15% of all its imported oil from Iran at quite a bargain price. And through this, it's provided an economic lifeline to the regime. So it's not in China's interest for this regime to fall. It doesn't want to lose its influence over Iran or weaken its influence overall in the Middle East. Now, the second reason that Beijing is watching this closely is because it's concerned about its energy security, especially if Iran chooses to close the Strait of Hormuz. Not only does its imports of Iranian oil pass through there, so does its imports of oil from Saudi Arabia, which is Beijing's second largest provider of imported oil. And it also buys gas from Qatar and from the UAE, which also passes through this strait. Now, despite these very grave concerns from Beijing, we're unlikely to see Beijing make any material participation in this conflict beyond strong statements, beyond being active in the United Nations. And this is because generally China approaches any international conflict very cautiously. It doesn't have any formal allegiances. It has partnerships, but not any security allies. And it's very reluctant to enter any war without it being absolutely necessary for China to do so.
Katrina, thank you very much indeed. Katrina Yu there in Beijing. Iran's requested an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council. Iran's permanent representative to the UN is urging the Council to condemn the US strikes. Abbas Aslani is a senior research fellow at the Center for Middle East Strategic Studies. He's joining us from our Tehran bureau. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. The last time that there was a meeting of the UN Security Council, there was a lot of criticism of Israel. There was support for Iran. Not a great deal else. What do you think Iran can expect from this second meeting?
Rob, Iran has been fed up with the role that the international organizations and specifically the IAEA Director General have been playing. Tehran considers the role of the IAEA chief contributing to the process whereby his report was a prelude for the Israeli aggression and as well as American attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities. And that's why Iran has been in different letters have urged UN as well as the IAEA to condemn these attacks, and they have been blaming the IAEA chief for his inaction and indifference toward this process. And in the Security Council meeting, I think what Iran will be demanding will be strong condemnation against the aggression on nuclear facilities, because Iran deems those attacks, violation of international law, specifically the NPT. And that's why I think Iran wants to question the legitimacy of those attacks on the facilities.
One of the things that's increasingly being asked is whether or not Iran is likely to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, because that will be some way, certainly, of showing its displeasure at the IAEA. But, of course, that would also remove it from any checks and balances that the IAEA could have over Iran's nuclear program. How likely is it, do you think, that Iran might choose to do that?
Rob, Iran is, pursuing different measures in parallel. One is the military retaliation. The second is, pursuing the issue politically, trying to gain support from and backing from other countries to condemn this attack and question what the U.S. and Israelis have been doing. And what the other option, which is gaining momentum these days, specifically since early morning, is Iran's withdrawal from the NPT. This might have some costs, but Iran feels that it is in a situation whereby, in order to resolve this issue, in order to somehow recover, it needs to have a kind of, let's say, a surgery or operation that might have some damages or some, let's say, pain. But in order to recover and to get rid of this illness, Iran thinks that this is inevitable. And similar issues also true about the military retaliation. Some are saying that if Iran responds or if Iran withdraws from the NPT, others will react or it might have some consequences. But the point is that if Iran does not do so, the consequences will be much bigger than these, options.
I want to ask you about the response that there has been to the U.S. strikes and the lead up to them from both China and Russia. Of course, both allies, certainly closely linked to Iran. Do you think that there's a sense that Iran is disappointed in the response that it's had from China and Russia, who have condemned what has happened, both in the run-up to the strikes and the strikes themselves? But from what our Beijing correspondent was suggesting, there may not be anything more tangible than that.
Well, if you mean that the backing that China and Russia, offer military support or much more than the political stances, this is not something Tehran is expecting from those capitals, because that is understandable for Iran that they might have some reservations. Iran has good relations with them, but those countries might have had relations with Israel as well. But the point is that their political stances has been somehow favorable to Tehran. Iran's foreign minister is meeting Russian president tomorrow, and Iranian officials have had consultations with Chinese officials as well. But the point is that those countries, when it comes to the IAEA Board of Governors or when there is a session at the United Nations Security Council, they have had positions which have helped Iran, and this is also could be important for Iran. This is not the case that Iran to be expecting a, let's say, significant help like a military one from those countries. They might be having their own considerations.
There's been a lot of speculation about the kind of response that Iran is going to have to the U.S. strikes. And of course, many of the U.S. bases that there are in the Gulf region are in countries that do have, to some degree, relations with Iran. To what extent do you think that is going to shape